Welcome back to our growing experiment. We're here with Krista from Zone 3 Vegetable Gardening. So, Krista, can you tell us about yourself and what you do and how you got started?
For sure. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I feel very honored to be part of this. I started with my gardening journey as a child, working alongside my mom, mostly in our family vegetable garden. I was raised in the Okanagan in Vernon, BC, where the climate is very different than where I am now. And when I was about 11 or 12 years old, I planted some pumpkin seeds into some cups, and they grew so quickly, as pumpkins do. And my mom, being a wise mom that she is, she got me to transplant those myself outside and said, those are your pumpkins. You need to take care of them. So I kind of took ownership of those seedlings and transplanted them outside. I somewhat resentfully, I guess, I was like, I had my fun. I watched these germinate and I'm done now. But I planted them in the garden and pretty much left them all summer. And by fall, we harvested at least 2 big wheelbarrows full of pumpkins. And my parents really were supportive in me and telling me, you grew these, you planted them, you put them in the garden, and this is what it grew. And I think that's kind of when I got hooked on gardening, just seeing how much fun and how easy it can be. Although I've also learned it can be just as difficult sometimes as it is easy. And then we moved to Alberta when I was about 14. And when I was 16, I started working at a greenhouse. I very much enjoyed that. It was mostly working with flowers there. And there was a part of me that knew that my heart was really in vegetable gardening and growing food. Growing flowers was fun, but I just felt like there wasn't that much of a point to it. I like flowers, but I prefer to grow things I can eat, I will admit. And so I worked there seasonally for quite a few years. And once I graduated, I worked there full time for about 3 years. And then I moved into EMS, working as a primary care paramedic, but I continued working at the greenhouse seasonally until I had kids, I think, and life started to get too busy. So, and then it was growing food for my family. It was in east-facing backyard at first, where I had very limited space and very limited sunlight, and so I struggled with that. I got a community garden and did that for 2 years. And that was a lot of fun. It was neat to be part of that gardening community, and the vegetables grew awesome in the community garden. That's something I highly recommend to people who have limited space but have access to a community garden. And then it was about 7 years ago, I moved to the 4 acres where we are now and had a lot of space to grow. Was super excited about vegetable gardening. And my first year gardening, I went to harvest my beets and my carrots, and they were tiny. And I felt like I had failed. And I thought, what the heck? I thought I knew how to garden. Like, my mom grew giant stuff and I helped her. How come I can't do this? Through trying to figure that out, I realized I had very poor soil and no phosphorus in my soil. So through that struggle, I've got to learn a lot about garden soil. And that's one of my specific passions, I would say, is helping people who struggle with garden soil to improve their soil quality and be able to grow that way. And then it was about 3 years ago, I started a website for gardening. And the purpose for that was it's really hard to find good information on vegetable gardening in northern climates and in the cool growing zones. A lot of what comes out is from those warmer climates and it's not adaptable for us. So my website and my Instagram, Facebook, I try and share lots of gardening tips for those growing in northern climates and make it a little bit easier for them. I'm hoping that the mistakes I've made, others won't have to make because I can share what I've learned. That's kind of to sum up my gardening journey and what's brought me to where I am today.
Okay. And so along that journey, it sounds like you probably picked up a few skills in a few different places. But when you really started to get into it, like especially when you talk about learning how to build up soil, where did you start learning how to build up soil and how do you go about that?
A lot of it is self-research. I love looking things up, reading things, books, talking to other gardeners. And so I am mostly self-taught in those areas. I'm thankful to know some wonderful gardeners that I've been able to go to with questions. And then a lot of it is trial and error, things I've learned, trying to fix my phosphorus. And I've struggled for a lot of years. And it's only just in the last year I've learned that unless I can lower my soil pH, which is very, very alkaline, it's difficult to adjust the phosphorus levels. And some of it has been podcasts. I do love listening to gardening podcasts, and there's some great ones on soil health. And so as I run, I will put on, actually just the other week, it was a really good soil health podcast I listened to for my run, and that's what I enjoy listening to.
Okay. So with that being kind of considered there, the level of your pH in the soil there, are you thinking that you're going to take the route where you're going to amend it and try to level out that pH? Or do you think you're going to bring in other soil and build up the bed in a different way for that? Or how are you going to kind of conquer that phosphorus problem? Or are you just sort of top feed it? Or
I'm going to do that from both those directions for sure. So sulfur, and trying to make sure if you do buy a sulfur source that it's aluminum-free sulfur, because there is sulfur sold for gardens, more for flower gardens, that has aluminum in it, which isn't something that you necessarily want to be putting in a vegetable garden. But with the research I've done on sulfur, it is a natural source, something that can lower pH. It's very effective. So I've already gone and distributed some sulfur onto my garden. And then tomorrow, actually, I'm driving out to a mushroom farm that has mushroom compost available. And this mushroom compost is high in phosphorus. It's a more stable form of phosphorus as well. It's one that plants should hopefully be able to use and absorb. So I'm doing both. I'm continue to try and lower my soil pH as well as add in some phosphorus where I can.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. I mean, that would be perfect. It makes sense, like using the mushrooms as sort of that source, right? Because they're naturally something that's going to break down on a floor and then be consumed readily by the plants in that area, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I know that you...
So
Sorry, go ahead.
The mushroom compost, just to be clear on the mushroom compost, it's the mycelium, I think is how you say it. So it's what they grow the mushrooms in, which this mushroom compost happens to be a wheat bran base is part of it. And wheat bran, doing some research on that, is actually high in phosphorus itself. So it doesn't have mushrooms in it. They've already grown mushrooms in it, and then they just sell that material, and I can add that into my soil. But it is very healthy, and a healthy microbiome that has developed as it grew mushrooms to add into my own soil.
Yeah, there must be part of some of the mushroom substrate, not necessarily the fruiting bodies, but then also it must also be like partially broken down by the mushrooms, because I'm assuming they would have composed or consumed it rather.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned that one of the challenges that you had with your garden, but what else do you what else do you have to consider? Like you mentioned, growing in a cold climate, there's not a lot of information around that. So, what do you got to really consider when you're growing in a cold climate?
I think you really have to look for ways to extend your growing season where you can. My number of frost-free growing days can be as little as 57. Some years that might even be less. We've been known to have snow in every month of the year. I know a friend that's just about 5 kilometers away from me. She had quite a hard frost, enough to hit her cucumbers pretty hard in mid-August. So looking for ways that maybe to protect the plants when the temperature does drop, and then growing cold hardy plants later and earlier in the spring and the fall. That's something I've been learning a lot about. And then looking for ways to warm the soil if that's possible. So I've tried using the black poly that you can put on top of soil. It has holes for planting in, sometimes called black mulch. And that really keeps the heat in the soil and helped for my squash, my corn, my pole beans, helped grow those things. Also starting things indoors. So last year was my first year I started corn indoors, and it did really well. It was also the first year I've harvested corn after 5 years of trying, I think. I don't give up easily. Like, there's got to be a way. But yes, starting indoors and using that black covering on top of the soil, between the two of those, I had a wonderful corn harvest, even with my very short growing season. Another simple one, maybe a somewhat obvious one, is looking for seeds with the shortest days to maturity that I can find. That's often something those of us in cold growing climates and short growing seasons have to do.
Yeah, so like I'm thinking with a lot of like tomato varieties and stuff like that, you're talking about probably 75 days and around there for maturity, right? And you said, how much was it? Was it less than 60 days or less than 50 days?
Yeah, when I Googled it, how many frost-free growing days does Black Diamond have? That's where I live. Google told me it was 57. Some years that might be 60 to 70. Frost times can definitely vary from year to year, but some years it might possibly be just under 60 days. So it's good to kind of plan for that as a possibility, I guess.
And you said that you started your corn indoors. Is there most vegetables can you start indoors, or are there a large amount that you can't?
A lot of vegetables you can. The root vegetables don't transplant well, so I don't start any of those indoors. A lot of the root vegetables can handle a little bit of frost, and a lot of them have short enough growing days that they can be grown outside. Beans are one that, they don't germinate well if the soil's cool. But beans, there's a lot of varieties that are 53 days, so I can start those, try and keep the soil warm and grow those to maturity in my short growing season. Another interesting thing, maybe you guys already know this, but I found out and hadn't realized through reading seed catalogs, something like tomatoes, as you mentioned, with a 70 days to maturity, often plants that you are supposed to start indoors. So if the seed package says start indoors 6 weeks before your last frost, the days to maturity is sometimes from the transplant date. So I initially always thought, if I start it inside, I can get that head start. But sometimes it shocks the plant a little bit and sets it back a bit. It takes a while to establish from that. And so then it needs 70 days on top of however many weeks that it needed to be started indoors. So yes, that's definitely things you have to take into consideration when selecting varieties to grow.
Yeah, because
especially in things.
I was just going to say, because even the dates, it's like optimal. When things are optimal, that's how long it takes. So like if it's a little bit colder than usual, it might take even longer.
For sure. And our nighttime temperatures are more cool than what would be ideal for any plants, and that slows them down. So yeah, when we look at that number of days to maturity, definitely an excellent point, Sophia, is that it's going to take longer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's something I didn't know at all. That's like that's actually like that's like a huge thing that that's awesome. So like you have a short growing season. What do you do to sort of maximize your yield? You must have like sort of space. You mentioned you have a fair sized property. So what kind of growing space are you kind of working with?
We just doubled our growing space this year. I use raised beds. We have a lot of deer around, so we can only grow inside the deer fence, or if it's outside the deer fence, it has to be plants that can handle having a couple bites taken out of them and things deer don't like to eat. I have successfully grown garlic and potatoes outside my deer fence. Inside my fence, my raised beds, right now I have 11 of them, and they're approximately 10 by 4. I haven't actually worked out the square footage of that, but yeah, that's the space that I have to grow in this year. I'm pretty excited about it. And yeah, last year I think it was more about 5 raised beds, so definitely significant increase, and wondering if I'll be able to keep up with it this year.
And so in those beds, what do you mostly have in there? Like, how do you divide up what you're growing and stuff like that? What's the planting look like this year?
So this year, I'm going to try some tomatoes outside my greenhouse. My greenhouse is a 10 by 11 unheated little greenhouse. It does keep it warmer and warmer at night, so that's where I've grown my tomatoes and my peppers. And this year I am going to try, just because I have so limited space in that little greenhouse, I'm going to try some tomatoes and peppers outside in my raised beds. I think I'm going to try using that black poly. I just have to work out irrigation with a well that has low gallons per minute. So I'm currently trying to figure out if it's possible to do some soaker hoses underneath those on an irrigation system. As far as, I think you're asking kind of what I grow quite a few carrots. They grow excellent in this climate. They grow well in the soil, and they store in our garage fridge. I use the perforated Ziploc vegetable bags when I store carrots. And since I'm on the topic of storing carrots, make sure I don't wash them. I just wipe them off with a cloth. I put a piece of paper towel in with those bags, and I still have crisp, crunchy carrots in the garage that I've just been saving because I don't want to run out of garden carrots. So I could have grown more and we could have eaten more, but I'm just kind of hoarding these last few. But anyways, yes, I will grow lots of carrots, lots of beets. We love pickled beets, so I plan to pickle more beets for next year. Beans, I usually chop up and vacuum seal. Definitely always looking at ways of preserving as well as growing. Again, when you have a short season, you don't just want to be eating your garden vegetables for 2 months. You want to be able to hopefully eat those year round by preserving them. The lettuces, of course, those don't take as much space. Spinach, I often freeze spinach as well in vacuum seal bags, and I'll just break off chunks for smoothies or chop it up and throw it into pastas. My kids don't even seem to notice it there, so that's an excellent way to get some garden veggies in through the winter. And yeah, I'm going to play a little bit more, hopefully, since I have space, with squash and maybe even some melons. And again, with trying to keep the soil warm, starting things inside, possible plastic domes over the beds. I did that with some beds last year as well to protect them and keep them a little bit warmer at night. And yeah, kind of the basics.
When you talked about carrots and you said you put the paper towel in there, are you constantly replacing it, or?
I don't, no.
No, you could just you just leave it in there and that's enough?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I do go out to check on the carrots and I notice that it's damp, I will replace it. But if I do replace it, it's probably only once during the winter.
Okay. And I had seen somewhere recently, I don't know if you know anything about this, but I see people digging up carrots from the ground right now. Do you know anything about like growing carrots during the winter?
The carrots can definitely handle quite a bit of frost. I would say probably maybe down to minus 20. We got down to minus 37 Celsius or minus 38 where I am. I have tried leaving carrots through the winter and insulating them. Mine were mushy and weren't edible by spring. But parsnips, on the other hand, they survived my minus 38 winter and were still fine. I can peel them, add them into stew in the spring. So yeah, as far as where I'm located and my cold temperatures, I don't think I could do carrots through the winter. But parsnips I can do, and some people do spinach as well. Over winter spinach, they grow it, just trim it down, mulch it, and it will survive the cold temperatures and come up early in the spring.
Yeah, because that's kind of another interesting consideration too. And so thinking about overwintering and stuff like that, that kind of reminds me of garlic. Do you grow garlic at all, or have you tried that?
I do grow garlic. I love growing garlic. It's something that grows very well here. I do plant it in the fall around mid-October, usually. Cover it with straw, try and cover it with a good 4 inches of straw at least. And it is amazing that it survives those cold temperatures. I usually plant it about 4 to 6 inches deep, so it is a little bit lower into the ground. I think one thing people don't always realize, talking about perennials and things like garlic that you need to overwinter, is that it's just important to keep it frozen throughout the winter. as it is, insulating. So maybe you're thinking, so it's not getting too cold, and maybe it does that a little bit. But where I am, we get Chinook. So we get warm winds that come during the winter. We can get plus 20 days. We'll get randomly a few warm days. So if you have perennials in the ground and the ground starts to thaw and then it refreezes, that's often what will kill perennials. And things like garlic, if you had them in a bed that's too high off the ground, that could be a concern, is that it would thaw if it warms up during the winter and then refreeze. And that's often what will kill perennials or plants that you're trying to overwinter. It's not so much the freezing, it's the thawing and the freezing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that exactly makes sense. Because I know there's even certain flowers that are like wildflower varieties that you have to plant over. And they mentioned that it's bad to plant them. I think it was in the spring, because you could have exactly that happen, where there's sort of a freeze and a thaw and a freeze again kind of thing, and it'd kill the seeds right away.
Oh, yeah.
So you,
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so you mentioned you were planting tomatoes and peppers in the greenhouse. Is that the only things that you do in the greenhouse?
I do cucumbers. I have a consistent cucumber crop inside my greenhouse. Outside, whether I direct seed or I transplant it, it's a lot more inconsistent. I usually get a couple of cucumbers, but often my direct sown cucumbers don't germinate just because I don't get warm enough soil until July. And by that time, it's almost too late because I only have the 2 months left then to grow cucumbers. So yeah, cucumbers in the greenhouse, cucamelons, they're kind of fun. The kids enjoy picking them and eating them. And basil. Those are usually the plants I have in my greenhouse. I would like to try eggplant, but I don't have any this year. Next year, maybe.
And while we're on the greenhouse topic too, how do you deal with humidity and stuff like that? And sort of how do you deal with your greenhouse and the sort of temperature fluctuation and stuff like that?
The way I do it is probably not the best way, I will admit. I keep the door open during the summer and I keep a window open. And we do have 2 kind of pieces that you can take out in the wall just to allow a little bit more airflow. So I don't have any fans in the greenhouse, and my cucumbers do usually get powdery mildew by the end of August, but by that time I'm kind of done harvesting and I know it's about to freeze anyways. So fans is something I feel like probably should invest in. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. And then my polycarbonate on the roof is quite yellowed. So it actually doesn't heat up as much as it would if I had a new polycarbonate. Again, that's probably, not the best way to do it. Buy old polycarbonate. But it works. It does get a little bit warm in there, sometimes warmer than it should. And again, fans is something I would like to invest in. I feel like I probably would have a little bit better growth and healthier plants if I did have some ventilation in there. But currently, I'm just using nature, open windows, and the wind.
Yeah, in our greenhouse, that's something we're still working on. And especially in the earlier part of the season, like right now, where last week too, we had a few days that were really, really warm and we had lots of sun. And I was working in there on Sunday, and I think it was 37 degrees in there. And for your seedlings and stuff, that's way too hot, right? They hate that. But it's too early to put up the shade cloth because now this week we know it's going to be totally overcast. And so it needs all the sun we can get in there because we just put our tomatoes in there and we want to keep it as close to 10 degrees or above basically as possible, right? So we're kind of that's kind of the fun part about the early part of the growing season, I guess. And then once we get into the summer, throw the shade cloth on, but then you still got the same problem of having to be 30 degrees in there or more.
I would like to invest in some solar fans, I think. And there are things that can be triggered by temperature. They seem like they would be helpful in a greenhouse.
Yeah, we have solar fans and they seem to work pretty well.
Yeah, they help, but it gets really hot in there.
Yeah, it's still hot. I guess there's only so much we could fight nature, right?
Yes. How big is your greenhouse?
It's an 18-foot growing dome.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I think it's 115 square feet like growing space.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's
quite
like
a bit.
yeah, it's like basically the way it is like the path we have in there is about a foot wide, and it probably goes, I don't know, 8-9 feet kind of in a sort of semicircle kind of arc in like
Oh
basically parallel to the wall going along to like say the
yes,
north wall.
I've seen pictures. Yeah, it looks beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we really like it. We're still learning how to use it properly. This is our second year, but as we kind of get going, we'll get better with it. But we got some peppers that are looking like they're getting ready to go in there pretty soon. So we're pretty excited about that because last year we were able to grow stuff right into November, and we don't put any
Wow.
heat in there, so that was pretty good. We were pretty happy about that because we're kind of in a lucky spot, I guess, in Ontario where we do get like cold snaps in the winter. Like we do get the -30 spells and stuff like that, and we'll get into the -30s. But then it's like this time of year seems to get fairly mild, and then our falls and early winters are fairly mild.
Yeah, I think throughout the years it's changed a little bit. I remember it used to be colder at this time of year, but having it being warmer really works out for us to be able to plant things earlier. So that's kind of nice.
That is nice. I've been playing a lot with growing cold hardy vegetables in my greenhouse. So right now I actually have spinach, pak choi, radishes, some lettuces, and some kale growing in my greenhouse. And it's been down to -10 a couple times this week. I will put a plastic dome. I have hoops that I can add a second layer or even a third layer if I need to. But I found that those things survive quite well till about -14 even. So I haven't been bothering to cover them because it's getting so hot during the day. So it just, yeah, when the sun comes up, it heats up, as you mentioned, then I'm opening the door to cool it off. But it is really neat to be able to grow those cold hardy plants in the greenhouse and extend it and into the fall too, right? I've done that as well. Last December was extremely cold, so a not good one for having those plants into the winter. But yeah, especially if you can get them to grow ahead of time as the days get shorter, they'll tolerate the cold temperatures well. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book Growing Undercover.
No. Nope.
I think it's called. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't think of the author at the moment, but I learned so much about growing cold hardy plants and them tolerating frost, realizing, oh man, there's this whole second crop I can grow in my greenhouse. So the end of May, before I put my tomatoes and peppers and my heat-loving plants in my greenhouse, I will hopefully harvest or maybe transplant a couple of things like the kale. And yeah, the radishes should be done by then and be able to do the 2 crops in the greenhouse.
Yeah, that's kind of how we set up our season this year. The only thing that we did is I think we're trying to be a little more cautious this year because we want to like grow a lot. So I think we could have planted probably earlier our cold hardy crops because right now our tomatoes in our house were just way too big and it's nice enough for them to go out to the dome right now. So we just took all the broccolis out and threw the tomatoes in. So that's good to know for next year.
Yeah. I feel like so much of gardening is experimenting and trying and seeing what works and not being afraid of failure. I think there's some people who feel like, you know, if a plant dies, then they failed. But I just feel like, okay, so now I know that one won't tolerate -17. And that's how I learned, is I tried. But look, it tolerated all the way to -14. And I used to think anything below 0 would kill all vegetables. And I've learned so much by experimenting and trial and error.
Yeah, so it sounds like you know a lot about gardening from your experience and all the self-teaching and stuff. So I know that you also do a coaching program. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
For sure. Yeah, I think a coach is something that I really wanted when I started out with gardening and I was struggling so much. And what I personally wanted in a coach was just somebody who had done it, somebody who's been there and somebody who's done it. You know, it wasn't about needing a university degree because there is people who are very knowledgeable and learned in gardening, but sometimes they haven't tried to apply it. And especially in places like the Chinook places where we have the thawing and freezing. And I have sometimes a June 17th frost that can kill plants. So yeah, through those beginning years of struggling, so many times I just thought, I wish I had somebody I could call. I wish I had somebody I could talk to. I wish I didn't feel like I was doing this on my own. So that's partly why I'm so excited and so thankful that I can do coaching and help others with their garden. I hope I can be that person. I do a long-term coaching package where they can continue communication and come to me with questions anytime. Or I do a coaching package where if they're local, I will go to their house and I can look at things like lighting and test their soil for them with just a basic home test kit, make recommendations on how to improve their garden soil and help them with the garden layout. I'll usually take companion planting into consideration when helping them with the layout. And then sometimes it's things like just noting this area of your garden will be a little bit warmer. So if you do want to grow tomatoes and peppers, put them here, and your cucumbers. And, your lettuce doesn't mind shade later on. So if a pea fence is shading your lettuce, place that here. I hope that my experience is really valuable with people planning out their garden with some of those things I have learned through my experience with gardening.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like that's something that would be really helpful. Like, I know for us, that's basically part of the reason we started the podcast. Like, we wanted to be able to ask people, and so we thought, well, maybe people would talk to us if we asked, and then we thought, well, maybe if people would talk to us, we could also record it, because maybe someone would learn something from the questions we might ask, kind of thing, right?
That's so amazing. I think that's just so cool that you guys have that and are doing that. And I think podcasts are a wonderful way to be able to learn a ton, especially for busy moms. Sounds like you guys have a little one or little ones as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can listen to that as you fold the laundry or whatever you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. It helps with that. And then for us too, it definitely helped us learn a lot more about the area we live in and the people who produce food in our area and stuff like that. And just had a kind of, it was part of our sort of undergoing a sort of paradigm shift, I guess, and or moving towards sort of aligning our actions more with our beliefs, right? Where it's you want to have access to good food and all that kind of stuff. Well, you got to kind of walk the walk, right? So it means you got to go and learn how to do it and all that. And we went and talked to people who were further along that path and asked them questions. So yeah, as long as it's a little bit helpful, we enjoy doing it is really why we do it. And if people enjoy listening to it and they learn something from it, then that's a bonus, really. But I mean, I don't know. We're thankful that people want to talk to us. It's just nice. But anyways, another one of the interests we have too is sustainability. So when it comes to sustainability, how much food are you able to produce? Are you able to sort of feed your family mostly on what you grow, totally on what you grow?
It's a little bit hard to put that into, I don't know, a numerical value. I am able to grow all our onions for the year, all our garlic for the year. This is actually the first winter that I still have plenty of garlic and onions. I had garlic to replant. So for those things, carrots, I will freeze some of them. So as it gets into June, when I don't quite have carrots ready, but maybe my fridge ones are starting to go soft, I can still use the rest of I'll chop up and vacuum seal carrots. So I can do them cooked or in soups or stews. Potatoes, I am not quite at the point where I've grown enough potatoes to last us through a year yet. So hopefully this year I will be making my potato garden bigger and growing the potatoes. We do raise chickens, so we have all our own eggs. But when we look at sustainability, I feel like it's easy to be really naive because we've had so many things, so many conveniences we don't even realize we're buying. So things like chicken feed, I have chickens and I have my own eggs, but I'm dependent on the store for providing chicken feed through the winter. I would love to figure out how to be fully sustainable with chickens and to be able to grow a crop that I could feed them through the winter, but I'm not there yet. But hey, it's a journey. It for sure is a journey. The chickens are a huge part in the garden because they eat so many garden scraps. And in the fall when we're cleaning up, the chickens use that, provide eggs, and then they provide wonderful compost for my garden. So I feel like chickens and gardening go so hand in hand. I wish everybody could have both. Yes, so I often go on this streak of trying not to buy vegetables, and it lasts until about mid-January when I realize, okay, Krista, stop this stubbornness and just go to the store and buy a few veggies, because the kids are getting tired of only eating carrots in their lunches, so my kids did only have carrots in their lunches till about mid-January when I started buying things like cucumbers from the grocery store and peppers. But yes, as far as fruit, I am far from providing all our own fruit. I've not been very successful with growing fruit on my property. It's actually been really discouraging. I hope that I'm learning in the process of trying, and I will not give up. But yeah, again, my poor soil and my rocky soil, it makes it really hard for anything to develop good roots, which is why I do the raised beds. So hopefully that helps answer a little bit the question of sustainability, and maybe a also vague way. We do raise chickens for meat as well, which I think it's really cool to know how they were treated, to know what they were fed, and to be part of that life cycle.
Yeah, well, and actually, that's a really good way to answer the question, because it does bring up a lot of the considerations when you start thinking about like, oh, sustainability, what does that really mean, right? And then in that exact example, right, like I was thinking about, say, the other day, how like we're striving to grow as much as we can to basically be as much of the staples that we normally eat, to have like that covered as much as we can for our next harvest. But then I was thinking about a lot of stuff like for our kids, especially because we try to make sure they have fruit and stuff like that, like bananas. We're not growing bananas here ever. Like that's just not going to happen. And then there's just like other fruit that are just kind of nice to have, that like it's nice to have these berries or those berries, but we planted a bunch of berry bushes, so we're hoping that those will eventually work out for us. And speaking of, have you tried any berry bushes in your area at all? Like you mentioned the fruit and struggling with that a little bit. Bushes sometimes do well in those areas?
Yes, I think the bushes are probably easier than the trees. So I have raspberries, which should be easy to grow. The deer got into my raspberries a couple years in a row. I didn't think deer were supposed to eat raspberries, but they do, especially if they're young. So I still haven't gotten a raspberry crop. I have strawberries. Hopefully my strawberries will have done well over the winter, because I planted a lot more in the fall. But I do get some strawberries, not enough to freeze though. The kids love the fresh strawberries and they eat as many as I grow. So it's only that season that we have fresh strawberries. Saskatoons are a berry I don't know if you're familiar with, but they grow very well out here. They're super healthy. They freeze well. They're kind of like a blueberry, but a little bit smaller. And Hascaps grow fairly well, so I have some of those going. I did get a few Hascap berries last year, but bushes, they still take a little while to establish. It's a lesson in patience.
Yeah, we're waiting on our bushes there too. We planted 3 Hascaps as well, and some blueberry bushes and stuff like that. So we're probably looking at another 2 or 3 years before we really start to see anything on them at all. And then, I mean, maybe we'll see something this year, but I don't think it'll be a lot. We were fortunate enough to get, I think, what was it, 4 apples or 5 apples off our trees there?
All 4 off one and 3 off the others, so 7 total.
Yeah, and that was the first year planted tree, which was super cool. And we were told you're not supposed to pick them because it like stresses out the plant or whatever, but I just watched it every day, and when that apple fell, I was like almost ready there waiting to catch it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it was super rewarding to have grown that. And then in another sort of like plant and wait kind of thing, we grew asparagus. So we had to wait 3 years for that. And that was actually super cool to finally eat like your own grown asparagus. And that's actually one of those things that totally makes a huge difference. Like your own grown asparagus fried up with a little bit of butter and salt in a pan, like the amount of flavor that's in that asparagus is like really like amazing.
Yeah, I do have some asparagus as well, but also I've never had a big harvest. And I've actually, none of it has made it to the pan. I can't believe how good asparagus is fresh. I don't know if you guys ate any of yours fresh without cooking it.
No.
It is crisp. It's not stringy at all. It's juicy. Like you said, totally different than store asparagus that who knows how long ago it was picked. And it tends to be a bit tougher. But I just kept, when I would see big enough asparagus, I would pick it and just eat it for breakfast in the garden. So
I'm going to try that this
Yeah, I'm going to try that now too.
definitely do. Yeah.
Now the asparagus won't make it inside.
No, your garden snack.
Yeah, exactly.
Usually it's the snap peas.
Yeah, the peas, yeah.
For breakfast. Yeah.
Yeah, we like getting into those.
I'm a big morning gardener. I like taking my coffee out to the garden and picking some weeds, checking on the garden, and eating veggies for breakfast while I'm out there.
Do you find it challenging keeping the garden and working full time?
So I only work part-time.
Okay.
I've only been part-time since our third daughter, who's 7 now. And then I was also off work for almost a year and a half with PTSD stuff with working EMS. I've been emergency services for 17, 18 years. I started as a volunteer firefighter. And I have learned so much through my time off. I'm doing much better, but I have found my passion is definitely gardening, and I want to move more into replacing my income through my gardening things, my website, and I'm working on a vegetable gardening course right now. It's 8 units. It is a big course. It's been a ton of work. I'm really hoping to get it out in the next week or two, and that it will be a really great resource for gardeners, and specifically gardeners in northern climates, to be able to work through and have a really good base and a really solid understanding of what their goals are and what to look for and those tricks that can help them be successful with their vegetable garden.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I like that idea of having that program set up there. That's awesome. And that's great too. Like when you find something that you really love doing and that you've learned lots about, and you have that skill to share with people, you got to run with that, right?
For sure.
Are you the only one kind of out in the garden, or is the family out there too?
It's only me in the morning. I'm the only morning gardener. My husband is a huge behind the scenes gardener. He doesn't think of himself as a gardener, but he's the one who's built all my raised beds. He helps me fill them. He's built the deer fences. He just does a huge amount. He flips the compost pile with his tractor all the time, which the compost is so important in the soil health. So he's a really big help to it. And then my daughters, my oldest more so, both like to garden. All the kids have had their own gardens at some points, but this year my son says he doesn't want his own garden. When they do have their own garden, they have to weed it and they have to help harvest it. So yeah, he will help me plant. I find kids love to plant the bigger things like peas and beans, especially. I don't blame them for not wanting to plant the carrot seeds and the lettuce seeds. Those are hard enough for me. But they love to play house and pick vegetables and make soup, which I think is so great. I love seeing them be creative and picking the vegetables, washing them in the hose and eating them up. I think that's awesome that I can provide that environment where they can do that.
And you mentioned you grew up with a large family. That must have been something sort of like what you grew up with, like being out in the garden, sort of helping plant, help harvest, and all that kind of thing, eh?
It was, yeah. I do remember having to weed and not enjoying that part of the garden, but we also, would pick vegetables and play house or whatever, make salads with them outside. It's a fun way to be able to do that with something actually edible that you can eat in the end.
And that kind of ties into another kind of question I had too. I think I seen on your page you mentioned that you were also homeschooled. Do you have any thoughts on that, or the experience that you had with that, the sort of pluses and minuses? Because it's something that we've sort of thought about as an idea for our kids in the future, and we're sort of looking at the pluses and minuses. So as a person who sort of grew up with it, what could you say about it?
I loved being homeschooled. I think it was really nice to be part of a big family and have so many siblings. We had a really good friend base and homeschool group base. I think pluses of homeschool, when they look at a school day for kids, I think the average is 2 to 2.5 hours of academic work kids do in a school day. So if we don't think at the big picture, sometimes we feel like kids go to school and they sit at a desk and they're working all day. Well, that's not reality. There is that 2 hours of academic work, and this is more the younger grades, not so much when you get into high school. But the rest of the day, things like sports and crafts and the other important parts of learning development, those can be done at home with parents, with siblings, in a way that I think allows a lot bigger and a lot more variety of children's specific interests. I think one thing with homeschooling that I really like the idea of is if your child does have a specific interest, like my son during COVID when we had them home for a little bit because I'm not homeschooling them, we did a space unit kind of because he was really into space. So I decided, you know what, this whole trying to do what the school's sending me, I was struggling with that. I'm like, we're going to do something fun. So we learned about space. We read about space. We watched videos about space. And my kids still remember so much of that. It really stuck with them. And it was a fun, memorable time as a family. Learning doesn't have to be this, this discipline. And when I say that, thinking of it if this is hard, it's not fun. Kids naturally love to learn. And I think homeschooling can create an environment where you can explore and you can enjoy learning in each child's own specific ways. And when they get to an area that they don't understand and they struggle with, you can have that one-on-one time. Like I noticed that especially in math. I would go along and some math concepts I would fly through. And so my mom would say, okay, you know what? I can tell you have a solid understanding. You can skip the second half of the unit and we'd jump to the next one. And then some math units I would stall on and I just could not get the concept. So we would stick at it until I got it. So it was almost like having a private tutor in that way. I feel like that was really beneficial. And then another benefit of homeschooling is that I learned self-study. I think that's something that I take with me even into gardening. As I mentioned, I love to read. I love to read different articles and to research and learn things myself. I think some of those skills I learned from being homeschooled and having so much self-study time. Maybe a little bit harder when you look at the higher grades and your high school diploma and applying for colleges that want you to have specific high school subjects and marks and grades. Sometimes that can be something that you have to look at as your child gets older. But I think especially the younger years, it's wonderful. I would have loved to homeschool if that's something that my husband had wanted for our kids. After my time off work, I still am at a place where I don't even really know exactly how to say it, but things don't come as easily for me as they used to, and engaging with my kids, the patience for my kids, I struggle in that a little bit. So I don't feel as confident as I would have 3 years ago on if I was to try and homeschool my kids this fall, but I think it is a huge gift parents can give them.
Well, like I like the two of the main components that you touched on there too. I liked how you talked about the little bit of sort of self-study unit that you did with your son there, because what I like about that is the concept that I heard some people bring up in a sort of different way, where it was a kid kind of shows an interest in a thing, like they'll start asking you a bunch of questions about space, or they'll ask you a bunch of questions about cars or dinosaurs or whatever, right? And if they're asking those kind of questions, it's like you just sort of help push them in a direction where they start kind of like reading the books or watching the things, right? And then all of a sudden they're coming back to you and they're saying, hey, I read this thing today about Saturn. Did you know it has this many moons or whatever, right? And they can tell you all kinds of stuff. And then the cool thing about that now is they're getting a positive feeling out of learning. They've chose to learn something. And like, there's a lot of independentness that comes out of that. And a lot of like, I don't know. I just feel like that's the best case learning. I feel like people who like really get into subjects, like even sort of another case point of that, I guess, is you getting into gardening the way you did. Like you mentioned that you had to really teach yourself, right? And that probably comes from that basis of knowing like, okay, I'm really interested in this. Where do I find the information? And then you just put the nose to the grindstone and away you go, right? And that's a super good thing, because like I feel like a lot of the people that we talk to in this space, they're very similar to you in that respect, where a lot of them are self-taught. If it's not handed down sort of generationally or familially, it's like they teach themselves kind of thing. And then I like anything that fosters that kind of spirit, because I feel like that independent, ingenuitive, I'm going to do it myself kind of spirit is really, really good. And then it's also, like you said too, now that we have people that take that route and they can turn around and say, hey, also, if you need help, I can also help you too. And so it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? Because now there's so much information that when you really want to go after it, you can get after it. And if you want a little bit of help, there's someone like you right there with a handout saying, hey, you need a hand? I can help you out.
For sure. And I think part of homeschooling is instilling the love of learning. I think schools miss out on that. They try and teach kids by forcing them to learn, and they miss out on instilling the love of learning. And that's where it comes from, getting to learn things that you're interested in, getting to focus on those things. You think about, if you were to try and listen to, or if I was to try and listen to a podcast on computer coding, I wouldn't hear any of it. I wouldn't take any of it in. But listening to a gardening podcast, I'm able to absorb that because I'm interested in it, and because, I have a desire to learn that.
Yeah, and I know for me too, like there was a point at school where I got kind of bored, and I stopped caring about school, and that's what it was. I remember I got bored. I didn't really feel challenged or anything like that, and I just kind of stopped caring about it. And then it was funny because I rediscovered learning in a way after, like I think when I was like 20 when I really started like reading again and stuff like that. And it was all stuff that I just wanted to read. And then it was fun because then, yeah, you kind of, as you're discovering stuff, it's like, the cool thing is like when you start out and you think you might know something, and then as you start to learn stuff, you realize you don't know anything at all. But then you kind of get lost, and then like you just keep falling down the rabbit hole of knowledge kind of thing, and because there's always a new thing to learn, so you kind of have that sense of wonder again, which is fun because you're on an adventure or a treasure hunt kind of thing for these golden facts or golden tips for your garden or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, for sure.
So it was great talking to you. It was a lot of fun. I feel like we learned lots. If people want to get a hold of you or get in contact with you for your coaching program or something like that, how would they go about that?
Definitely, they could check out my website, which is zone3vegetablegardening.com. I'm also on Instagram. I post there almost every day. So if you are on Instagram, definitely come follow me on there. As well as I mentioned, Facebook. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook group that I run as well. Pinterest, I do show up on there and post pins if you happen to want to find me on there. I also have a vegetable gardening journal. I don't know if you guys have taken a look at it. It's either digital or hard copy that people can print off and help them record their notes, because I feel like gardening, so much of it is almost like a scientific experiment, as we touched on. And a big part of that is taking notes, keeping notes of, if you start something earlier, what temperature kills it. So yeah, I have a gardening journal you can check out on my website under the store tab.
Perfect. Thanks so much for sharing, Krista.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It was so much chatting with you guys. I always love talking to other gardeners and feel like there's so much information to be learned from them.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you.